A champion show-jumping horse suffered a severe injury during a competition. Its owner, believing the horse was no longer capable of competing, abandoned it without a second thought. A young girl, driven by compassion, found the injured horse and took it in, dedicating herself entirely to nursing it back to health. What the horse eventually did for its former owner left everyone speechless. The wind whispered gently across the rolling hills surrounding the equestrian stadium, carrying a sense of anticipation that buzzed in the crisp afternoon air. Inside the main arena, the atmosphere was electric. Thousands of eyes were locked on the center of the field, where a chestnut stallion stood poised, embodying both power and grace. His muscular legs pounded the earth in a steady rhythm, almost as if he were mirroring the collective heartbeat of the audience. This was Apollo, the most celebrated horse on the show-jumping circuit. His coat, a fiery copper hue, glimmered like molten bronze under the sunlight, and his jet-black mane rippled with every movement, lending him an almost mythical presence. But it was his eyes, deep, dark, and brimming with an extraordinary intelligence that captivated everyone who beheld him. In that moment, there was no denying Apollo was a champion, a living legend. On his back sat Victoria Hayes, a rider as renowned for her skill as she was for her icy demeanor. Her light brown hair was meticulously tied into a sleek bun, as composed and polished as her expression. She wore a navy blue riding jacket adorned with gleaming gold buttons, knee-high black boots that shone like polished obsidian, and a helmet fitted perfectly into place. At just 25, Victoria had already claimed every accolade a rider could aspire to, but her ambition was unyielding. The course began with the resonant clang of the starting bell, a clarion call to greatness. Apollo launched into action with the elegance of a dancer, his movements a perfect fusion of power and precision. The synchronization between Victoria and Apollo was breathtaking. Every subtle shift of her weight, every slight tug on the reins was met with seamless understanding. Each jump was a masterpiece, eliciting gasps of awe and bursts of applause from the spectators. But as they approached the final obstacle, something changed. The last jump was higher, an imposing wall that even seasoned competitors viewed with trepidation. Victoria tightened her grip on the reins, her voice a low murmur of commands that Apollo instantly understood. With a mighty surge, he sprang into the air, yet in the final moment of takeoff, his hind legs faltered slightly. Though they cleared the barrier, his landing was clumsy, and a sharp, pained whinny tore through the air. The arena fell silent. Victoria quickly dismounted, her face a mask of irritation more than concern. "What happened?" she demanded curtly, as the veterinarian rushed to assess the situation. After a quick examination, the verdict was inescapable. "It's a tendon injury," the vet said. "He'll need complete rest for months, maybe longer." The words struck like a blow. For Victoria, this was unacceptable. Apollo wasn't a companion or a friend. He was a tool, a means to an end. And now, that tool was broken. That night, as the moon cast a pale glow over the stable, Victoria stood before the injured stallion. Her usual pride was replaced with a cold, calculating expression. "I can't afford to keep you useless for that long," she muttered, her voice devoid of warmth. The following days were marked by a series of deliberate, emotionless decisions. Victoria reached out to a broker known for handling complications, and Apollo was sold for a fraction of his worth. He was sent to a distant, neglected property where his care became an afterthought. At his new home, a rundown paddock overgrown with weeds, the once majestic champion began to fade. Without proper nutrition or treatment for his injury, Apollo's once lustrous coat grew dull. His powerful muscles, accustomed to constant motion, began to waste away. But the most haunting change was in his eyes. The fiery pride and keen intelligence that had defined him were replaced with a dull, sorrowful gaze, a silent plea for the care and dignity he had lost. Fate, however, had other plans. In a modest house nearby, 12-year-old Emma spotted Apollo for the first time. Her dark, unruly hair fell across her shoulders as she peered through the weathered wooden fence at the forlorn horse. Her heart ached at the sight. "Mum," she called, her voice tinged with urgency. "There's a horse in the old paddock. He looks terrible, like he's sick or starving. Can we help him?" Her mother, a weary yet kind woman, let out a sigh, her face etched with both care and caution. "We don't have enough for ourselves, sweetheart. We can't take care of a horse. But if you want, you can bring it some water." And so began Apollo's journey toward redemption, though Emma had no idea how deeply it would change both their lives forever. At dawn, Emma woke up, unable to shake the image of the horse from her mind. The old paddock wasn't far from her home, just a 10-minute walk along a dusty path cutting through an open field. With a bucket of water in one hand and a few pieces of stale bread in the other, she set off. The first rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, while a soft morning mist veiled the landscape in an ethereal glow. When she reached the paddock, Emma's heart sank at the sight of the horse up close. Apollo stood, but barely. His body, which still bore faint traces of former majesty, was now a ghost of its past self. His ribs jutted visibly beneath his weathered skin, and his tangled mane was dull and lifeless. His large, dark eyes met hers, with a mix of wariness and resignation. "Hey there, friend," Emma said softly, careful not to startle him. She approached slowly, holding out the bucket as if it were a peace offering. Apollo let out a faint whinny, his ears twitching slightly. Emma took it as a glimmer of hope. "He must be so thirsty," she thought, as she set the bucket down on the ground. The horse hesitated at first, but eventually lowered his muzzle and drank eagerly. Emma watched him with a bittersweet smile, wondering how such a beautiful creature had ended up in this dire state. Over the next few days, visiting the paddock became Emma's daily routine. Every morning she brought fresh water and scraps of food from the kitchen for the horse. At first, Apollo kept his distance, but gradually he began to trust the girl. It was as if he understood she meant no harm. Still, Emma knew her small gestures weren't enough. Apollo needed more than water and scraps. He needed veterinary care, proper food, and most of all, a safe and loving place to live. One afternoon, after spending hours by Apollo's side, stroking his neck and talking to him as if he could understand, Emma made up her mind. That evening, over dinner, she broached the subject with her mother again. "Mum, I can't just leave that horse to die out there. We have to do more for him," Emma pleaded. Her mother sighed and set her spoon down. "We can barely get by ourselves." "How do you plan to care for a horse? It's a lot of work, Emma, and expensive too." "I'll work harder," Emma replied, her voice firm with determination. "I'll take better care of the garden or help the neighbors with their animals. But I can't ignore him, Mom. He needs me." Her mother studied her in silence, seeing in Emma's eyes a blend of innocence and resolve that reminded her of her younger self. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but on one condition. Everything you do for that horse will be your responsibility. If you decide to help him, you can't give up halfway." Emma beamed, barely able to contain her excitement. "Thank you, Mom. I promise you won't regret this." The next morning, Emma went to the paddock with a makeshift rope and an old blanket she'd found in the barn. Apollo, though still weak, seemed livelier after the care he'd received in the past few days. "Come on, buddy," she said as she gently looped the rope around his neck. "Let's get you home." The journey was slow and fraught with challenges. Although her house wasn't far, Apollo stumbled often, his steps awkward from injury and exhaustion. Several times, Emma had to stop and let him rest. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at the small plot of land behind her house. Emma had cobbled together a modest enclosure with wooden fences and straw to make a comfortable space for the horse. "It's humble, but it's yours," Emma said, guiding him into his new home. Apollo seemed to understand. He let out a soft snort and lowered his head as though acknowledging Emma's effort. The days that followed tested her resolve. Between school, household chores, and caring for Apollo, her time was stretched thin. She spent hours tending to his wound with warm water and makeshift bandages, feeding him whatever scraps she could manage to gather, and brushing his coat to rid it of dirt and tangled knots. Though the work was exhausting, Emma never complained. Each small sign of Apollo's recovery was a reward in itself. Still, not everything was easy. Whispers began to circulate among the neighbors when they noticed the horse in Emma's yard. "That animal's useless," some said. "Might as well sell it for meat and make a little money." The words reached Emma's ears, but she chose to ignore them. She knew Apollo was far more than a burden. To her, he was extraordinary, and she was determined to prove it. Slowly, a bond grew between them. The once motionless horse began to stir, showing subtle signs of improvement. He learned to recognize Emma's voice, and the lifeless look in his eyes began to fade, replaced with a spark of gratitude. The way he gazed at her seemed to say, "Thank you for not giving up on me." What Emma didn't realize was that her decision to save Apollo would not only change her life, but also ripple through the lives of those around her. Apollo had a destiny yet to unfold, and his story was only beginning. 3 months passed since Emma had brought Apollo home, and the transformation was remarkable. Although he still bore traces of his earlier frailty, his muscles were filling out again. His chestnut coat gleamed under the sunlight, and his once matted mane now swayed clean and smooth in the breeze. But the most striking change was in his eyes. No longer filled with resignation, they shone with strength and gratitude. The bond between them had grown unbreakable. Emma spent hours by his side each day, not just feeding and grooming him, but talking to him as if he were her closest friend. "One day, you'll be as strong as you once were. Just wait and see," she'd say, stroking his neck. Apollo, as if he understood every word, would whinny softly and rest his massive head against her shoulder. Yet, Emma knew recovery wasn't complete. Apollo's wound had healed with her care, but he still limped and avoided running. One afternoon, as she watched him from the makeshift pen in her backyard, Emma decided it was time to take the next step. "Come on, Apollo. Today we're trying something new," she said, her voice brimming with excitement as she opened the pen's gate. With a rope in hand, she led him toward the wide, open field behind her house. It stretched far, lush with fresh green grass, the perfect space for Apollo to move freely without any constraints. At first, he hesitated, his gait still stiff and cautious. Emma urged him on gently. "Just a little farther, my friend. You don't need to run. Go at your own pace." Gradually, Apollo relaxed. His steps grew bolder, his stride lengthened, and then, as though some long-lost instinct awakened within him, he began to trot. Emma watched, a mix of awe and joy filling her chest. "That's it, Apollo. I knew you could do it," she cheered. The horse lifted his head high, and for a fleeting moment, Emma saw in him the champion he must have once been. Training became their daily ritual. Every afternoon, Emma brought Apollo to the field, encouraging him to go a little farther, to stretch his legs with more vigor. She fashioned small bales of straw into makeshift hurdles, coaxing him to jump over them. At first, his attempts were clumsy and low, but over time, Apollo began to regain his natural agility. From the kitchen window, Emma's mother watched the pair. Though she had doubted the wisdom of bringing the horse home, she couldn't help but feel proud of her daughter's unwavering dedication and the progress Apollo had made. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, her mother finally spoke. "You have a gift, sweetheart. That horse trusts you in a way most people never earn." Emma smiled, her heart full. "It's because he knows I love him, Mum. And I know he'd do anything for me if he ever had the chance." What Emma didn't realize was that chance would come far sooner than she expected. One sunny afternoon, as she was training Apollo in the backfield, a car she didn't recognize pulled up in front of her modest farmhouse. She barely noticed at first, too focused on Apollo's progress, until a man's voice called from the porch. "Hello? Anyone home?" It was Mr. Fletcher, a neighbor from miles away, who occasionally traded cattle with local farmers. Emma led Apollo back into the paddock and approached the house. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fletcher," she said politely. "How can I help you?" "Afternoon, young lady. I heard you've got yourself a horse. Is that true?" His tone was friendly, but something about it made Emma feel uneasy. "Yes, it's true," she replied, keeping her voice casual. Mr. Fletcher nodded, glancing toward the paddock. When his eyes landed on Apollo, they widened with astonishment. "Where did that horse come from? He's magnificent, though he looks like he's been through a rough time." Emma hesitated. She didn't want to reveal too much, but saw no point in lying. "I found him abandoned and decided to take care of him." Mr. Fletcher studied her for a moment, then smiled. "Well, let me tell you, you've got a real treasure there. That horse isn't ordinary. He's got the bearing of a champion. With proper training, he could compete again one day." Emma felt a swirl of emotions, pride mixed with apprehension. The idea of Apollo competing again was thrilling, but it also meant drawing attention, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher, but for now, I just want him to heal completely." The man nodded and took his leave, but his words lingered in Emma's mind. That night, as she stroked Apollo's mane under the soft glow of the moon, she whispered, "Maybe one day you'll race again, my friend. But even if you don't, all that matters is that you're happy and healthy." What Emma didn't know was that destiny was already at work. In a grand mansion far away, someone was frantically searching for a lost horse. Meanwhile, word spread through the small rural community about the horse Emma was caring for. Children, ever curious, began gathering at the edge of her property, peeking through the wooden fence to catch a glimpse. "He's huge," they whispered to each other, awestruck by Apollo's size and beauty, even in recovery. But with the whispers came adult gossip. "That horse must have cost a fortune. How did she get her hands on it? It's not safe for such a large animal to be with them. What if something happens?" Emma tried to ignore the murmurs, but she knew it wouldn't be long before someone tried to interfere. Still, she was determined to protect Apollo no matter what. One afternoon, while working with Apollo in the field behind her house, Emma noticed a sleek black car driving slowly down the dusty country road. The vehicle gleamed, a stark contrast to the weathered tractors and pickup trucks typical of the area. The car came to a stop in front of her house, and a woman stepped out. She exuded an air of authority, dressed in immaculate white slacks, polished leather boots, and a tailored black jacket that highlighted her slim figure. Her light brown hair was swept into a flawless bun, and her sunglasses concealed her eyes. Emma froze. She recognized her immediately. Victoria Hayes, the equestrian who had once dominated the spotlight at riding competitions. Victoria strode toward the house, her gaze sweeping over the modest property with thinly veiled disdain. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. What was this woman doing here? Leaving Apollo behind, she moved to intercept her. "Good afternoon," Emma greeted cautiously. Victoria turned to face her, removing her sunglasses to reveal steely gray eyes. "You must be the girl looking after the horse." Emma's heart raced. "Yes, that's me. Why do you ask?" Victoria let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Why does that horse belong to me?" The words hit like a punch. Emma took a step back, her mind swirling with questions and fear. "What do you mean?" she asked. Victoria crossed her arms, her gaze a mixture of disdain and condescension. "That horse is Apollo. I sold him a few months ago because he was no use to me anymore. But it seems someone abandoned him, and now you found him." Emma clenched her fists, struggling to rein in her indignation. "You sold him? Why? He was injured and barely alive when I found him." Victoria's expression hardened, as if she had no patience for explanations. "I didn't have the time or resources to waste on a worthless horse, but now I see he's recovered quite nicely. Thanks to you. I think I'll take him back." "You can't do that," Emma said, raising her voice. "You left him. You didn't care for him, and I've spent months nursing him back to health. Apollo is mine now." Victoria laughed, her tone icy. "Child, you have no idea who you're dealing with. That horse is worth more than everything you have here. Legally, he's still mine, and I can take him whenever I please." The argument was interrupted as Apollo, who had been watching from a distance, stepped forward with a determined stride. Emma turned to him, while Victoria regarded the horse with calculating eyes. "Impressive," Victoria murmured. "He still has that commanding presence. I can't believe I almost let him go." Apollo stopped beside Emma, lowering his head toward her as if seeking comfort. Emma stroked his neck, feeling the tension in his muscles beneath her touch. "You can't take him," she said firmly. "Not after everything we've been through together." Victoria moved a step closer, but Apollo whinnied sharply, tossing his head as though to shield Emma. Startled by the horse's reaction, Victoria hesitated, her grey eyes flickering with uncertainty for a moment. "Think carefully, girl," she finally said. "I'll give you a week. If you don't hand him over, I'll return with the authorities. And trust me, you won't stand a chance against me." With those words, Victoria strode back to her car and drove off, leaving Emma trembling with frustration and fear. That night, sleep evaded Emma as Victoria's words echoed in her mind, blending with the dread of losing Apollo. "I can't let her take him," she whispered to herself. But what could she do? Suddenly, she remembered something Mr. Fletcher had said weeks ago. That horse has the spirit of a champion. If you train him right, he could compete again. An idea began to take shape. Perhaps there was a way to prove that Apollo was no longer the discarded horse Victoria had abandoned. Maybe, if she could show his true worth, no one could take him away. With renewed determination, Emma resolved to do whatever it took to protect Apollo, even if it meant standing up to Victoria and the world. The week that followed was a mix of anxiety and resolve for Emma. She knew Victoria wouldn't forget her threat. She had to act swiftly if she wanted to keep Apollo safe. Each morning at dawn, Emma was out in the field, working with Apollo harder than ever before. Her plan was bold, nearly impossible. Train Apollo for a local jumping competition set to take place in just a few weeks. Emma had heard that Victoria often attended such events. Though she hadn't competed in years, her presence as a spectator would be enough for Emma to prove that Apollo was no longer a useless horse. The first day of rigorous training was challenging for both of them. Emma improvised jumps using logs and old wooden crates, lining them up in a straight path across the field. Apollo, though stronger than when she'd found him, hesitated at the higher jumps. "Come on, buddy, you can do this," Emma encouraged, holding a rope in one hand and lightly waving a stick in the other to guide him. Apollo trotted toward the first obstacle, but stopped just short, pawing the ground in frustration. "It's okay," Emma said softly, approaching to stroke his neck. "We'll try again." Day by day, Emma worked with relentless patience and dedication. In the mornings, she focused on building Apollo's stamina by making him run laps. In the afternoons, they practiced jumps tirelessly. Every time Apollo overcame an obstacle, Emma cheered with such enthusiasm that it seemed to infuse the horse with renewed confidence. Slowly but surely, Apollo began to regain not just his agility, but also the pride that once defined him as a champion. One afternoon, as they practiced under the fading light, a battered old pickup truck rolled into the yard. Mr. Fletcher stepped out carefully, leaning heavily on his cane. His keen eyes tracked Apollo as the horse cleared a modest jump with effortless grace. "Impressive," he said, his deep voice breaking Emma's focus. "Mr. Fletcher!" Emma exclaimed, rushing to greet him. "What brings you here?" "Pete." A faint smile crossed his weathered face. "Word got around that you've been training the horse. I figured I'd see for myself." His gaze shifted to Apollo, who snorted softly as if acknowledging his presence. "That animal has potential. A lot of it," Mr. Fletcher said thoughtfully. "But you're doing this alone. You'll need help if you want him ready for something big." "Help?" Emma asked, her curiosity piqued. Mr. Fletcher nodded slowly. "I'm no trainer, but I know someone who is. If you're willing, I could ask him to come by and lend a hand. From what I see, you and this horse have a connection, but you'll need all the support you can get if you're planning to take on someone like Victoria Hayes." At the mention of Victoria's name, Emma's expression tightened. The idea of working with someone else tugged at her mind. Apollo had been through so much. She couldn't bear the thought of anyone treating him like an object again. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher," she said after a moment of hesitation, "but I think Apollo and I can handle this ourselves." The older man regarded her with a mix of admiration and concern. "You're brave, child, but remember, you can't always do everything alone. If you change your mind, you know where to find me." That evening, under the vast expanse of stars, Emma stroked Apollo's mane, her thoughts circling back to Mr. Fletcher's words. She knew he was right. Preparing Apollo for a competition in such a short time was daunting. But no one knew Apollo like she did. "We've got this, buddy," she whispered, resting her forehead against his. "No matter what they say, you and I are a team." The next morning, training resumed with renewed vigor. Apollo's progress was remarkable. Emma noticed something different in his demeanor, a sharp focus, an alertness as if he understood the stakes. It was as though he was just as determined to prove himself. After weeks of relentless effort, the day of the competition arrived. Emma was exhausted but ready. A kind neighbor had lent her the entry fee, and despite the polished appearance of her rivals and their expertly trained horses, she refused to let herself be intimidated. As she arrived at the venue, the murmurs started. Riders and spectators alike cast curious and skeptical glances at the pair. Some whispered, likely wondering what a young girl with a horse of such an unusual appearance was doing there. But Emma straightened her shoulders, tuning out the noise, her focus locked on her goal. It wasn't long before Victoria Hayes appeared. Dressed immaculately, with an entourage trailing behind her, she exuded the confidence of someone used to commanding attention. Her sharp eyes landed on Apollo, and she halted abruptly. "What is this?" she murmured, her brow furrowing as she approached Emma. "This," Emma said firmly, meeting her gaze head-on, "is a competition. Apollo and I are here to show that he doesn't need to go back to you." Victoria let out a laugh, sharp and dismissive. "You think you can win against professionals? What a waste of time." Emma didn't respond. Instead, she ran a soothing hand along Apollo's neck. The horse stood tall and calm, his poise unshaken. It was as if he too understood. This was their moment to shine. "We'll meet on the track," Emma said before turning and heading to the preparation area. With every passing second, the tension mounted. She knew this wasn't just another jump. It was the ultimate test for Apollo and for herself. If they could conquer this challenge, no one would ever dare underestimate the horse that had once been abandoned. The hum of the event buzzed through the air as Emma adjusted Apollo's saddle. Around her, other riders chatted, checked their horses, and fine-tuned their strategies. Emma, however, stood apart, focused entirely on her partner. "Listen, Apollo," she whispered, stroking the horse's forehead. "Whatever happens out there, you've already proven how amazing you are. This is just one more step." Apollo let out a soft whinny, tossing his head with a confidence that mirrored her words. The competition had begun, riders navigating the course with precision and grace. Emma watched from the sidelines, her eyes fixed on every jump, every calculated move, as a wave of nerves twisted in her stomach with each flawless leap. Finally, the announcer called her name over the loudspeakers. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A girl so young, what's she doing here? The townsfolk, intrigued by the rumors of her training, leaned forward with curiosity. But amidst the hushed commentary, Emma heard only the pounding of her own heartbeat and the steady breath of Apollo. She mounted swiftly, feeling the horse tense slightly as they entered the arena. The course was complex, a labyrinth of obstacles varying in height and difficulty. Some were nearly as tall as Emma's shoulders, towering like formidable giants. The judge raised his hand, signaling the start. Time seemed to freeze. Emma exhaled slowly, gave a gentle squeeze with her legs, and Apollo began to trot forward. The first obstacle was a low bar, unimposing. Apollo cleared it with ease, as if to prove he was ready for greater challenges. She guided him to the next, a taller, more daunting hurdle. Again, Apollo sailed over it, his movements fluid and precise. The crowd began to murmur, their skepticism giving way to awe. "That's no ordinary horse. Look at how he moves." From the stands, Victoria watched with her arms crossed, her expression shifting between disbelief and irritation. Every jump Apollo made chipped away at her certainty that he was still the worthless horse she once believed him to be. The real test lay ahead, a sequence of rapid combinations demanding flawless synergy between rider and horse. Emma tightened her grip on the reins, leaning forward slightly as Apollo quickened his pace. With every leap, he seemed to defy gravity, his legs stretching out in perfect arcs. At last, they approached the most challenging obstacle, a towering wall adorned with flowers and shrubs. It had tripped up many of the day's competitors, costing them precious points or worse, knocking them out of the race altogether. Emma felt a knot tighten in her stomach as they neared the wall, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. "You can do this, Apollo. I believe in you," she whispered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. As if understanding her completely, Apollo surged forward, gathering every ounce of strength before launching into the air. For a fleeting moment that felt like an eternity, they hung, suspended, and then landed cleanly on the other side. The crowd erupted into cheers, astonished by their flawless performance. In the stands, Victoria rose to her feet, unable to mask her amazement. Emma and Apollo finished the course with the fastest time of the day. Not only had they cleared every obstacle without error, but they had done so with a grace and elegance that evoked memories of Apollo's championship days. As they exited the track, competitors approached Emma, offering their congratulations. She smiled, patting Apollo's neck, the bond between them unspoken yet undeniable. Together, they had silenced every doubt, rewriting their story with every leap. "That horse is a marvel," one of the men said, his voice tinged with awe. "I can't believe you trained him all by yourself." "Thank you," Emma replied with a warm smile, gently stroking Apollo's sweat-dappled neck. "He does all the hard work. I just guide him." Not everyone shared the admiration. Victoria approached, her expression hardened by a mixture of frustration and bruised pride. "Not bad, kid," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "but it changes nothing. That horse is still mine, no matter how many cheers you get today." Emma met her gaze with her characteristic, calm resolve. "Apollo isn't yours anymore. You abandoned him, and I saved him. He doesn't need someone like you to tell him what he's worth." Their confrontation was interrupted as a judge approached, holding a gleaming trophy in his hands. "Congratulations," he said with a grin. "You and Apollo have taken first place." Emma accepted the trophy, scarcely able to believe it. The crowd erupted into applause once more, but her focus remained solely on Apollo, who seemed to radiate pride alongside her. "This is just the beginning, my friend," she whispered to him as they walked away. From the stands, Victoria watched them with a complex mix of resentment and something that could almost be mistaken for admiration. The first-place trophy sat on the dining room table, catching the golden hues of dawn streaming through the window of Emma's modest home. Still buzzing with the excitement of the previous day's victory, Emma was in the makeshift stable, brushing Apollo's coat with deliberate, affectionate strokes. Each movement was a silent expression of gratitude toward the horse who had become her closest companion. "We did it," she said with a smile, offering him a piece of crisp apple. "No one can say you're not special now." Apollo snorted softly, lowering his head as if to share in her quiet triumph. Their peaceful moment was abruptly shattered by the sound of a car pulling up outside. Emma's heart quickened as she rushed to the door. Her stomach knotted when she saw Victoria Hayes stepping out of a sleek black car, accompanied by a tall, broad-shouldered man in a uniform that screamed official authority. "What are you doing here again?" Emma demanded, her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. Victoria's lips curved into a cold smile. "I've come to reclaim what's mine, girl. I don't care how many trophies you've won. Apollo is legally my property, and now I have the paperwork to prove it." The man beside her nodded, holding up a folder of documents Emma couldn't decipher from where she stood. "Miss Emma," he said in a detached tone, "this woman has provided documentation establishing her ownership of the animal. If you don't surrender him, you could face legal consequences." A surge of anger burned through Emma. She had poured everything into proving that Apollo wasn't just an abandoned horse, but a creature deserving of love and respect. Yet now, standing before Victoria and the law, she felt small and powerless. "Apollo is my family," she said fiercely. Victoria let out an impatient sigh. "Look, kid, I get that you've grown attached, but this isn't a fairy tale. Feelings don't matter here, laws do." Before Emma could respond, the sound of deliberate footsteps drew everyone's attention. Mr. Fletcher appeared at the edge of the path, leaning on his cane, but wearing a look of steely determination. "That's not entirely true," he said, his voice firm as he approached. Victoria's brows furrowed. "And who might you be?" "Someone who knows more about horses than about laws," Mr. Fletcher replied, unfazed by her sharp tone. Turning to the man in uniform, he continued, "Are you aware that there's a clause in local law protecting abandoned animals? If this woman left the horse malnourished and written off as lost, she effectively forfeited her rights to him." The officer hesitated. "That could be true, but I'd need evidence." A faint smile tugged at Julian's lips. "And evidence we have. Photographs of Apollo's condition when Emma found him, as well as testimonies from neighbors who witnessed it all. Do you want to take this to court? Because I'm more than ready to do it," Mr. Fletcher said, his voice steady and resolute. Victoria clenched her jaw, her irritation unmistakable. "Are you really going to complicate things over a girl and a horse that isn't even worth what it used to be?" Mr. Fletcher took a firm step forward, his gaze locked onto Victoria's. "What it's worth to you doesn't concern me. What I do know is what this horse means to Emma, and I won't let you take it from her life without a fight." Emma felt a spark of hope ignite within her as she heard his words. The tension in the air was palpable, but for the first time, she didn't feel completely alone in this struggle. Victoria looked between them, her expression a mix of disdain and frustration. Finally, she exhaled sharply and turned to the officer nearby. "This isn't worth my time, but remember this. This isn't over." Without another word, Victoria stormed back to her car, slamming the door before speeding away, dust billowing in her wake. The officer shrugged, his demeanor casual. "Looks like there's nothing more to be done here for now, but I'd recommend continuing to gather evidence, just in case things escalate down the line." When the confrontation ended, Emma turned to Mr. Fletcher, tears streaming down her face as she embraced him tightly. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher," she whispered. "You're welcome, child," he replied, patting her shoulder reassuringly. "You and Apollo deserve better than this. But don't let your guard down. Victoria won't give up that easily." Emma nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "No matter what she does, I won't let her take him away from me." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma sat beside Apollo in the open field, watching the sky turn shades of gold and orange. The horse grazed peacefully, its mane rippling in the soft evening breeze. Despite the challenges ahead, Emma felt a quiet resolve. Apollo was more than just a horse. He was a part of her soul, her anchor in a world full of uncertainty. The tranquility of the moment was suddenly shattered by the roar of an engine in the distance. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was speeding recklessly. Emma's heart sank as she scanned the horizon, her eyes narrowing when she spotted a black car tearing through the dusty hills. "What is she doing?" Emma muttered under her breath, her brows knitting together in concern. Victoria had always been a woman in control, cold and calculating, especially when it came to her wealth and her horses. But now she seemed different, driven by something wild and irrational. The car approached, faster and faster, zigzagging on the uneven road. Emma's pulse quickened as she realized the driver wasn't handling the curves well. The engine roared like a furious beast, and the car's erratic movement sent dust clouds spiraling into the air. Emma leapt to her feet, her instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. Before she could reach a safe vantage point, the car veered sharply, the back tires skidding wildly in the loose dirt. The vehicle swerved uncontrollably, the wheels spinning as it careened off the road. Emma watched in horror as the car plowed through the safety barrier and slammed violently into a large oak tree. The impact was deafening, the kind of sound that left a ringing in your ears. The force of the crash sent the car airborne for a brief moment before it landed on its side at a twisted angle. Smoke and debris filled the air, the mangled vehicle emitting an ominous hiss as flames began to flicker around the hood. "Victoria!" Emma screamed, her voice breaking with panic. Her legs moved instinctively as she raced toward the wreckage, fear gripping her chest. The closer she got, the more her stomach churned at the sight before her. The car lay precariously on its side, its engine sputtering and small flames licking at the edges of the hood. Emma's heart thundered in her chest as she reached the site of the accident, desperation fueling her every step. The danger was clear, but she couldn't stand by while someone's life hung in the balance, no matter who it was. The sight of the vehicle, now a mangled wreck of twisted metal, sent a chill racing through Emma's veins. She froze momentarily, her eyes darting through the haze of smoke, desperate to spot Victoria inside. Her heart pounded as she leaned closer, peering through a small gap in the shattered windshield. There, slumped motionless, was Victoria. She wasn't moving. Panic seized Emma, her mind spinning with fear and unanswered questions. Was she hurt? Was she even conscious? The smoke thickened, curling into the air as the engine roared and flames began licking hungrily at the edges of the vehicle. Emma knew she couldn't stand still. Her heart thundered in her chest as she took a hesitant step forward, but halted just as quickly. The fire was creeping toward the windshield, and if she didn't act fast, Victoria would be consumed by the inferno. It was in that tense moment she saw Apollo, her loyal horse, emerging from the nearby field, his alert eyes fixed on her. Without hesitation, Emma ran toward him, her determination overriding her fear. She quickly threw on the saddle, her hands trembling but efficient. "Apollo, we have to help her," she whispered, her voice shaking as she glanced at the thick plume of smoke rising from the wreckage. Apollo snorted as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Emma mounted him in one swift motion, and with no time to lose, she urged him into a gallop toward the site of the accident. The wind whipped at her face as she raced across the field, her thoughts consumed by Victoria and the danger that threatened to claim her life. Every second felt like it stretched endlessly, the urgency pressing down on her with every heartbeat. As she approached, the sight of the overturned car with smoke billowing from its interior made her grip the reins tightly. The acrid stench of burning metal filled her nose, and the heat radiating from the flames stung her skin. Apollo slowed just enough for Emma to leap off before he fully stopped. She ran toward the wreck, her eyes scanning the scene. Smoke was pouring from the engine, and flames were crawling up the hood. The air felt suffocating, heavy with heat and ash, and the crackling sound of fire filled her ears. Emma stopped just short of the car, her instincts screaming at her to keep her distance. The fire was dangerously close to the front, and she knew it could explode at any moment. Frantic, she searched the area for something, anything that could help. Then her gaze landed on Apollo, who stood nearby, his gaze steady on her, as if offering silent support. Emma took a steadying breath, her mind racing for a plan. Her eyes fell on a sturdy tree branch lying on the ground nearby, likely blown off during a recent storm. Without a second thought, she ran toward it and dragged it over to the car. Sweat dripped down her face as she struggled to lift the heavy branch, adrenaline propelling her movements. Apollo watched her intently, as though he understood the weight of what she was doing. Once the branch was in place, Emma used it as a lever, slamming it against the jammed car door. One strike, two, three. Her arms ached. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but she didn't stop. Finally, with a groaning creak, the door gave way, inching open just enough for her to reach inside. The fire was spreading rapidly now, the flames greedily consuming the vehicle. Emma reached into the car, her hand trembling as she fought against the smoke and heat. "Come on, Victoria," she murmured under her breath, her voice raw with desperation. Time was slipping away, every second feeling like an eternity as she struggled to pull Victoria free. The heat grew unbearable, and the relentless smoke burned her eyes and lungs. Flames danced closer, their searing heat licking at the overturned vehicle with an unrelenting fury. The sound of the fire snapping and roaring around her only spurred Emma forward. Her mind raced with determination. She couldn't fail. Not now. Not when Victoria's life hung in the balance. "Come on, Victoria. Wake up!" Emma's voice cracked with desperation as she shouted, peering through the shattered windshield. Her eyes darted over Victoria's motionless form, pale and bruised from the impact. Emma's heart raced as she realized time was slipping away. If she didn't act now, the growing flames would destroy any hope of saving her. The car door was jammed, refusing to budge despite her frantic attempts, and although the trunk had given way slightly, it wasn't enough. Gritting her teeth, Emma threw her entire weight into pounding against the door, her body trembling with exertion. A sudden guttural sound made her glance up. Apollo, her horse, stood nearby, his ears pricked forward and nostrils flaring, as though sensing her urgency. Nay, Emma didn't hesitate. She sprinted to him, her voice firm but pleading. "Apollo, we need to move this. Help me, please." The horse, as if understanding the gravity of the moment, shifted closer. Apollo pressed his massive body against the overturned car, his muscles straining as he pushed. The vehicle groaned, shifting slightly, but the door remained stubbornly shut. Determined, Emma scrambled to the back of the car, dust and sweat streaking her face. She pounded against the metal with renewed vigor, her fists throbbing from the effort. At last, the twisted frame yielded, opening just enough for her to squeeze through. Ignoring the searing heat and encroaching flames, Emma crawled into the wreckage. The acrid smell of burning metal filled her lungs, but her focus was unshakable. Victoria. She found the woman slumped over, semi-conscious, her forehead bleeding and her body marked with bruises. The flames licked dangerously close, the heat intensifying with every second. Emma knew there was no room for hesitation. Summoning every ounce of her strength, Emma hoisted Victoria into her arms. It was an agonizing effort, her muscles screaming in protest, but she dragged Victoria toward the narrow opening. The fire was relentless, its fiery fingers reaching into the car. Outside, Apollo stood motionless, his dark eyes fixed on Emma, silently urging her to keep going. Victoria stirred faintly, her voice barely audible. "Why are you helping me?" Emma didn't pause. "Because what you've done doesn't define you. You deserve another chance." With a final, desperate pull, Emma got Victoria out just as an explosion rocked the car, sending a wave of heat and debris rushing toward them. The force threw both women to the ground, their bodies sprawling on the dirt. Apollo was there in an instant, his powerful frame standing protectively over them. Emma forced herself to her feet, gripping Victoria tightly with one arm while clutching Apollo's mane with the other. "Come on, Apollo, let's go," she urged. The horse surged forward, his gallop steady and sure as he carried them away from the inferno. Her heart pounded wildly, and her breath came in ragged gasps as she clung to the horse. Behind them, the flames consumed the wreckage entirely. But Emma didn't look back for long. She had done it. She had saved the woman who once tried to take everything from her. They stopped once they reached the safety of a clearing, the cool country air offering a brief reprieve. Emma gently laid Victoria down, her own chest heaving with exhaustion. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Victoria nodded weakly, tears streaming down her soot-streaked face. "Yes. Thank you. Thank you for saving me." Emma didn't reply. Instead, she turned to Apollo, who stood resolutely by their side, his gaze fixed on Victoria as if he, too, understood the significance of what had just happened. Victoria broke into quiet sobs as she looked at him, her voice shaking. "I never should have tried. I'm so sorry." Victoria didn't fully grasp what she had done. Emma held her gaze steady, her voice calm yet firm. "It doesn't matter what happened before. What matters is that you're here now and that things can still change." Victoria nodded, her eyes fixed on Apollo, the horse that had become a lifeline in her darkest moment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for everything." Emma offered her a soft, reassuring smile. "Just make sure you never forget what truly matters." For the first time, Victoria seemed to comprehend the weight of the message. She had been given a second chance, a rare opportunity to make amends for her mistakes. It was thanks to Apollo's bravery and Emma's steadfast courage that she now stood on the brink of redemption. The evening sky darkened, casting long shadows across the fields as the three of them, Emma, Victoria, and Apollo, moved safely away from the roaring fire that had consumed the barn. The crackling of flames faded into the distance, replaced by the stillness of the open countryside. Leaning against Apollo's neck, Victoria breathed heavily, her body trembling, but clearly relieved to have survived the ordeal. Emma stood nearby, watching the scene unfold with a mix of exhaustion and quiet gratitude. The horse, her protector once again, had done more than save her life. He had also saved the woman who had once sought to take away what Emma held dearest. The irony wasn't lost on her. Breaking the silence, Victoria spoke, her voice low and uncertain. "I never thought anyone would save me. Not after what I've done. I thought I didn't deserve another chance." Emma knelt beside her, meeting her gaze with unflinching honesty. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Victoria. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after them. You've been given a chance to learn, and you've finally started to see what's truly important." Victoria's eyes shifted to Apollo, standing quietly, his dark eyes filled with a calm wisdom. She smiled faintly, gratitude softening her expression. "I owe him my life, and I owe you for doing what no one else would." Emma gently stroked Apollo's neck, her touch full of appreciation for the horse's unwavering strength. "You don't just owe him your life. You owe him the chance to change, the chance we all owe ourselves. And of course, we owe this incredible horse for never letting us down." Victoria nodded, her shoulders heavy with the burden of reflection, but her resolve growing stronger. For the first time since the accident, her perspective began to shift. All that she had done, all that she had lost, now seemed part of a larger lesson she was finally beginning to understand. Regret wasn't enough. Action was necessary. "I want to make things right," she said with newfound determination. "I know it won't be easy, but if you give me the chance, I'll prove that I can change, that I can be someone you can trust." Emma studied her for a long moment, searching her face for sincerity. Then at last, She smiled. That's all we need to hear, Victoria. The future depends on what we choose to do today. No matter what's happened, you have the chance now to do the right thing. Lowering her head, Victoria touched her face, as though finally beginning to grasp the full weight of the moment. I never imagined I'd end up here, on my knees in front of you, asking for forgiveness for what I've done. But if there's one thing I value now, it's that you didn't turn your back on me, even after everything. Emma's smile held a trace of sadness. That's because I know what it feels like to be judged for past mistakes. Nobody's perfect, Victoria. It's about moving forward and not giving up. As the last light of day gave way to a sky glittering with stars, the two women sat in silence. The soft rustle of leaves carried by the night breeze was the only sound breaking the quiet. Emma glanced at Apollo, who stood motionless, as if he understood the significance of the moment. The horse had not only saved a life, but had also mended the fractured bond between two women who had once been rivals. Over time, Victoria began to show real change. She worked closely with Emma, helping care for the horses and participating in equestrian competitions with a renewed sense of purpose. Though she could never erase her past, she dedicated herself to earning the trust of those she had hurt. And in time, she succeeded. Emma and Apollo remained champions, but more importantly, they became the steadfast guardians of an unexpected friendship, a bond born in the crucible of hardship and sustained by an act of courage and compassion. In the months that followed, as the echoes of the past slowly faded, Emma, Victoria, and Apollo were inseparable. At every competition, during every training session, their connection deepened in ways none of them could have imagined. The woman who had once sought to take away what Emma cherished most had now become her most loyal ally. And Apollo, ever faithful and wise, stood as a living emblem of strength, kindness, and redemption. His story was not just one of a champion show jumper. It was the tale of a noble horse who taught everyone around him the power of resilience and the beauty of second chances. In the end, it was Apollo who brought together the people who most needed healing. Life continued, with its share of new challenges and triumphs, but the memory of what truly mattered lingered. A reminder of the courage to protect, the bravery to forgive, and the wisdom to redeem. Wow, what an incredible journey, right? Even though this story isn't real, it's packed with so much emotion and meaning that it feels like it could be. It's the kind of tale that sticks with you long after you've heard it. At its core, this is a story about redemption, courage, and the power of second chances, not just for Apollo, but for everyone involved. Emma's kindness and determination remind us how one person's compassion can spark incredible change. She didn't see Apollo as a broken tool, but as a life worth saving. That perspective changed everything, not just for the horse, but for herself and even for Victoria. It's proof that empathy and resilience can build bridges, even in the most unexpected ways. Then, there's Victoria's transformation. It's easy to judge her actions early in the story, but her redemption arc shows that it's never too late to change. That powerful message of forgiveness and growth is something we all need to hear. The scene where Apollo helps save her life? That's the perfect reminder of how the smallest seeds of kindness can lead to something extraordinary. This story also shines a spotlight on the bonds we form with animals. Apollo wasn't just a horse. He was a healer, a protector, and a symbol of hope. It's a beautiful reflection of how much we can learn from the creatures we care for. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What moments in this story stood out to you the most? Did it inspire you to see things differently? Let me know in the comments, And if you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to share it with someone who could use a little inspiration today. Let's keep the conversation going.